What you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences. And I've always sort of found you would see things that you would not automatically have come across.
Hello and welcome to the Parliamentary Review podcast, the podcast that puts leadership in its sights. I'm Jonathan White, and in each episode I'm joined by directors, CEOs, CFOs, government ministers, chairmen, presidents, maybe one day even the Queen, although I think she's earned some time off after the year she's had. The aim is to discover who these people are, the people who get up each morning and make the world work. We discuss everything from the Bank of England's latest interest rate decision to the future of broadcasting and cable television, and of course, the innovation and success in the country that make it all worthwhile in the end. We also get their take on the current political and economic state of the country. Later on in this episode, you'll have the chance to hear our exclusive interview with Lord Pickles, former Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Chairman of the Conservative Party, and of course the current co-chairman of the Parliamentary Review. But for now, we're joined by Angela Kerr, Managing Director and owner of AKA Case Management. Emerging from a series of pilot projects commissioned by the government in the early 90s to encourage best practice when dealing with people suffering from brain injury, AKA Case Management provide community-based rehabilitation alongside care services. Angela is one of the country's leading experts in the care and case management of brain-injured individuals in the United Kingdom. Starting out as a neuromedical nurse, she went on to establish AKA in 2002, and today we discuss the company, the sector, and what the future holds for both. Angela, welcome.
Oh, hi, Jonathan.
Well, thank you very much for coming on today. And I thought it'd be a very pleasant way to start. It's been a few months, obviously, since AKA Care Management has been in the review. I think the listeners, Angela, would love to know how you and the team there are and what have you been up to?
Okay, yes. Well, as you know, Jonathan, we provide rehabilitation support to people with traumatic brain injury and complex needs. So we're quite a niche and specialised organisation. And what we've been involved with is obviously working on the ground, as always, but also trying to influence the sector by improving quality in the area through what is called the British Association of Brain Injury Case Managers, where we have recently put out guidelines for the sector around registration with the Care Quality Commission for case managers. So that's the up to date. In fact, we did that today. Actually.
Oh, fantastic! So get more up to date, really, could you?
No, we couldn't.
I think. Well, never a quiet day. I'm sure we'll go through some of that in a little bit more detail. I think in a bit, and but I think so people are aware. Obviously, Angela, the concept and of the business started a while ago. It originated from a series of pilot projects in the 1990s. If you could, Angela, what are the central tenets of the case management strategy, and why does it work so well?
Okay, so what case managers do, and it is a very interesting concept. So say you take someone who has a brain injury, for example, and they may have been injured through a road traffic accident, so they may have a compensation claim. If they do have a compensation claim and liability is agreed, then the solicitor will appoint a case manager to do an initial needs assessment and evaluate what. And part of that initial needs assessment will be defining the service that will be required to enable that person to recover as much as possible. And part of that initial needs assessment may well be provision of care and providing that care to support the rehabilitation programs. So the case manager will then coordinate those resources. So they will be kind of working alongside the individual and the family to evaluate and monitor what's happening on the ground, changing the services as the individual's needs change to the point of that person becoming fully or as fully recovered as possible. And then that may well be that the service no longer required, or there's a maintenance service in place to keep that person at the level that they've reached. So it's very individual. I think that's probably the best way to put it, Jonathan.
I think
we work very individually.
Absolutely, the key word there, because it's so important, maybe to personalise care, as it were. Each patient is unique. Now that must come, though, logistically speaking, with its own challenges. And how have you found the best way to make sure that you have for example, the right staff at the right time for the right patients?
Well, that's a really good point, because you've got to have the right skills on the ground. So your case managers are the key people, and case managers tend to come from either nursing or occupational therapy backgrounds, or other therapies like physio or speech and language therapy, with the special interest in our sector, in my particular sector, aka case management sector, as being brain injury and complex needs. So they may well also be neuro trained to handle those needs. And then the interesting point for care side of things, then we would look to recruit carers to work with the individual, and the individual themselves will be part of that recruitment process, so they will select their care staff. I don't know if you're aware that there's the care certificate that carers are, which is part of the skills of care. So if they haven't already got there, if they're new to care, then we would put them onto that Skills for Care programme and start their profile for them so that they're trained appropriately to work with the clients. So that's how we tend to work.
Now, of course, Andrew, you started now in 2002, and obviously it has very much gone from strength to strength. There's been a huge success in that time, and the physical growth has been fantastic, something you're very proud of, no doubt, and quite rightly too. But in those early days, and what with your background, but it being a perfect perhaps for the role, but there must have been some unique challenges, not least accessing the right resources.
Well, that is the problem. So, I mean, as you know, I started in 1992 as a case manager through the pilot project, so incorporated my own company in 2002. And in the industry, what's always been interesting is that, finding the right professionals as a resource, but also the funding as a resource to support the services to those individuals. So state funding, and things have changed a lot, because in the early days, you had to apply in a different way to the health authority or the commissioners to access the relevant funding to support the individuals in the community. But in October, and I can't remember the actual year, but it must be about 4 or 5 years ago, personal health budgets came in, where individuals then had the ability to manage their own funding and money and purchase services directly. But that's challenging when you have individuals that don't have the capacity to manage money appropriately, and they still have the right to that personal health budget. So one of the changes I suppose changes is not the right thing, because we have always had challenges with accessing state funding to support the level of service that's required on the ground. As you know, Jonathan, because part of our service that we provide is in the legal sector, we can access money through the compensation process, through interim payments if liability is agreed. So I guess in my sector, we have to be a lot more creative. We look at resourcing or the funding from statutory and health and through compensation money. So we've got to create the arguments for each, which are all very different. So to come back to your point, what's changed with the statutory service funding is the argument that you have to put to access the money to support the care on the ground. Well,
I think you've done a great job actually there, Angela, of actually quite laying out very succinctly there, really, what are the quite major challenges that you face on a day-to-day basis. Now, I'll put you on the spot here. Maybe it's a bit unfair, but Angela, you're Secretary of State for the day. You've got a magic legislative wand. If you were in that position, what is it you would do to reform the sector, or indeed, what could the government do that would really help you out on that front?
Right, that's a really
no pressure.
I think one of the things that we notice is care staff are not paid very well.
Yes,
and the main thing is to pay care staff better than they are currently being paid, because most of them are under the minimum wage. So it's not a great place for career opportunities. So to pay care staff and respect what they're doing on the ground, and the value that they're giving people's lives, would be one thing to focus on.
I think,
because then you may get people coming into the sector that have a career opportunity. At the moment, they're not treated very well.
I think, Angela, you've identified, and I think certainly maybe even understating it, it's a fundamental problem we have, I think, in the country, generally speaking, that if you are a carer, it is not something that society, for some reason, looks on with much respect. And they are, yes, and they are the angels that keep so many people living their lives every day. We all know that you could be paid more stacking shelves in the local supermarket than you could be as a carer. And I think that is that is a fundamental issue with the way we look at that profession and vocation in this country.
Totally. Because as you quite rightly summed up there, Jonathan, for some reason, we don't treat care staff very well. And yet the value they provide to someone's life is immeasurable.
Yes.
They change people's lives. They give the quality to those people's lives. And, what can you say about that? Some people are, I am sure the individuals that receive the service would pay, if they could, their staff a huge amount because of what they give them. And we also don't give the staff the time. I'm not saying that in my sector, but in generally, they've not given the time to devote to the individuals. They have to go from one person to another, travelling between them to see those individuals. So they're not able, they've probably got 15 minutes. So there's no conversation. And I know the Minister of Care, one of her roles is to look at loneliness. Well, care staff coming in, they may only be the person that the individual sees in the day, and it might only be for 15 minutes.
Go ahead, sorry.
It's important. Yeah, it's important that we value that, personal contact and respect and honour the care staff and what they do.
And I think we need some sort of covenant in that regard sooner rather than later. Not least even on a practical level, and it's in terms of staff retention, it becomes exceptionally difficult.
Because people see it as a stepping stone. I mean, and interestingly, we haven't brought up the word Brexit, have we?
Oh, you said it first.
Sorry. But the thing is, we do, you do get a lot of Eastern European and other Europeans coming into this country, and one of the jobs that they go for is care agencies and working as carers. Now, that does bring in its own problems and challenges because of language barriers sometimes, but, that is where they go. So, in some respects, we're going to have a problem because we won't have the numbers of staff that we need to support people.
Now, since you brought it up, Angela, I feel okay mentioning it. But have you, or maybe on a serious point, have you noticed? Obviously, we're speaking 2 days before the general election, so it's fairly uncertain. It's ruined everybody's Christmas, obviously. But have you noticed, first of all, in the last 3.5 years now since that the referendum vote, have you noticed, Angela, a decline in Europeans coming over for jobs like that? And do you hope that if, and this is maybe quite presumptuous, who's to guess anything anymore, but let's say, for example, as let's go with the odds here, the Conservatives are able to form a majority of some kind and introduce as they've promised, an Australian-style immigration system, we might hope to see that carers from wherever they come, Europe or further afield, might be treated quite highly on that point system.
Have I noticed any recline? I can't say that I have, but I go back to my point that we recruit specifically for specific individuals.
Yes.
What we found is we can put adverts out and not get any applicants. Now, whether that's down to the fact that employment figures are low, I don't know. We have in my sector, we don't have a huge amount of Eastern Europeans because when you're working with someone with a brain injury, sometimes it's very hard for them to understand someone who comes from this country, let alone someone with quite a strong accent. So, and we go down to personal choice. So I can't say that I have noticed a decline in applicants coming from Eastern Europeans, but what I have noticed the challenge in attracting people to the sector. So, like I say, when we put adverts out, sometimes we don't get any applicants.
Well, it will be interesting to see what happens going forward, and it's something we'll have to discuss, I think, Angela, another time sooner rather than later, hopefully.
I'll keep an eye on that, Jonathan, though, because when we talk again, I'll be able to give you a bit more detail, I imagine. Well,
turning back again specifically to AKI, I know that obviously you've been doing work and have been doing work with the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, especially when it comes to guidelines. How have you found working with them and the process generally?
Well, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because to get your voice heard, in a way. And again, I would say that that's part of my role within the British Association of Brain Injury Case Managers and what British Association of Brain Injury Case Managers are doing. So getting your foot in the door as people that can give actual genuine feedback on the ground is quite difficult. So it is very difficult to get your voice heard. Having said that, we have filled out information for the NICE to inform their guidelines. But again, things take a long time to come through. So I think that's the challenge. So the challenge is getting your voice heard in the first instance. And the second challenge is getting approval of documentation and policies going forward. The timing of that can be quite lengthy. And as you quite rightly mentioned, we're just waiting for a general election to occur and things could all change again. So that sort of delays things happening on the ground,
Once again, it's something we'll have to talk about another time, which is a pity, but we'll get there. But I looking at again, actually, I know you brought it up briefly earlier, Andrew. I'm conscious of the time, and I did want to talk about it. That there's a great big emphasis with yourselves at AKA Case Management about how important it is to be involved with the local community. And part of that is certainly, as you do, promoting the independence of your users. And that's not just, and to elaborate, but from my point of view here, I'd say, Andrew, it's not just important in terms of recovering medically, but also, so it's perhaps not always looked at the same time, parallel, but with their emotional confidence and mental health as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would say, Jonathan, the most important thing for someone who's been through or going through some kind of recovery because of trauma or medical negligence or a high-level injury, that the quicker you get the services in place, the better, because there's hope. And the challenge, quite often, as we always hear in the news, is the wait for services. So I did hear recently that a lady who had been psychologically damaged by an individual who had sexually assaulted her, she had waited for a year for counselling.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, fortunately for us as case managers, we can access services on a private basis. But as I said before, the main resource that can be a delay in that is the funding, because you've got to create the argument for it. And sometimes it is finding the right person that can provide that service, and they've got the capacity to do it too. So yes, mental well-being is very important, and it's creating hope for the future. So the quicker you get the services in place, the better.
Absolutely. Now, we must, I'm afraid, Angela, sort of wrap things up, but I will ask, and of course, caveats apply in terms of we don't know what's going to happen on Thursday, but it would be, I think, what are the plans at the moment for the next 12 months for AKA as it stands?
Right. So we cover the central England. So what we are doing more of is getting our communities together, and the communities being the staff and the clients. So ensuring that they have the ability to connect. So again, I suppose to combat loneliness in a little way. And do more and more of the same, and try and demonstrate and show excellence and quality service, so that helps to influence the industry going forward.
Superb. No doubt you'll have a busy time of it. And it's, Angela, it's thank you so much for joining us today. You'll certainly have to come back when we know a little bit more about what's going to happen over the next few months. We can talk about it. But for now, Angela, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan.
I hope you all enjoyed our chat with Angela, and especially learning more about the challenges facing the sector and how the whole team at AKA are continuing to raise standards. If you haven't heard it before, coming up now is our conversation with the Parliamentary Review's co-chairman, Eric Pickles. Lord Pickles served as Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government in David Cameron's cabinet before receiving a peerage in 2018. Lord Pickles remains active as the United Kingdom's anti-corruption champion and the country's special envoy for post-Holocaust issues, as well as being a keen vexillologist. That's flags, you and me. I hope you enjoyed listening as much as I enjoyed speaking to Eric. Here it is now.
Lord Pickles, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Now, I'm sure you won't mind me reminding the listeners that you've been involved in politics, both local and national, for quite a number of decades. Indeed, before the days we were in the common market. Given your experience over those years, what thoughts have you had over the last few weeks and months about the current political situation the country finds itself in?
Situation is quite dire because we have a parliament that is by and large useless. It's like a bored teenager on a long drive, and it knows what it doesn't want, and it's so bored with Brexit, but it can't agree. So no matter what you put up, it's against it. Are you in favour of a referendum? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of remaining within the single market? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of... No, I don't want to do that. No. And are you in favour of leaving without a deal? No, we don't want to do that. So it's against everything, but there isn't enough votes to be in favour of something. And it could be by the time this podcast goes out that Boris has started on the process of the bill, because we'll be voting on that today. But even then, what people don't seem to understand, this is not the end of Brexit.
Right.
This is barely opening the door of Brexit. We've got years of negotiations about trade agreements, relationships with Europe, putting down pieces of legislation. We get our agriculture, our fisheries, our financial services into place. Brexit is going to go on and on and on and on. I'm sure we are.
Now, the question is, I should actually remind listeners that we are talking on the day that the second reading of the European Withdrawal Act will take place. So as we speak, we don't quite know. As perhaps like the government front bench don't know what's going to happen. You compare Parliament to a petulant teenager. What do you do to a petulant teenager to sort it out? Is there a chance that it will see sense and push this through this bill without reckoning amendments? Is there a chance it will vote for its own for a general election? How do you see this playing out at the moment?
The sensible thing will be to put this deal through, because I've always been of the view a deal is better than no deal, because this is just the beginning. In order to start the process of Brexit, start the process of the United Kingdom taking over powers that it's not really exercised for 40 odd years, the smart thing is to get this thing through now. But in a way, it's not about Brexit itself. If there was a free vote, this deal would have gone through. Mrs May's deal would have gone through. But it's about politics. It's about a Labour Party that thinks it has a chance, trying to make the Prime Minister, whether it was Theresa May or Boris Johnson, look as though that they are in office but not in power, of delaying as long as possible. There's a lot of talk about an election in the autumn, maybe back end of November, beginning of December, something for us to look forward to before Christmas. It's beginning to look less likely. It's beginning to look as though they might want to drag it into spring to get as far away as possible from the rather decisive moment that Boris came back with a deal. We have to remind ourselves that nobody thought he could deliver a deal, and it has quite shocked them. And if you remember, all this process went through in order to ensure that we're left without a deal. When we have a deal, suddenly, well, no, it's not that kind of deal. We don't want that kind of deal. We want something different.
I think the vast majority of people in this country, whether Remain or Leave, now would be very satisfied for this to come to a amiable conclusion. And as correctly just said, because when it does come to those in the opposition who claim to want this to end, and then introduce wrecking amendments that introduce new objections to it, the general public are getting quite frustrated.
But you've got to understand that quite a lot of people don't get beyond a small area within Westminster, sometimes cliche referred to as the Westminster bubble, and go back to their own patch. Now, by and large, everybody hates their MP, except when they're at home, doing the fairs, wandering around, helping people. So they, in a way, they're cosseted to that great, which I feel is coming as a tsunami of change.
You were, of course, MP for Brentwood for
25 years.
Absolutely. What would you? I mean, of course, you resident there as well, despite being a proud Yorkshireman, obviously representing a good Essex seat. What would you say to your old constituents right now? Hang in there; it'll be all right.
Well, it's different when you're a member of Parliament because you've got to kind of toe the government line a little bit. So one thing I found now is I've got my weekend back and I say what I want, and I think I always say to our constituents is that it is pretty hopeless down there.
Excellent. Well, on that, I think, honest assessment, it's something I think the Parliamentary Review has always done quite well, talking frankly about problems, issues, and also not just good practice, but leadership.
Well, I was used to read it when I was a member of Parliament, because, what you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences, and I've always sort of found it quite a kind of a chatty magazine, but also you would see things that you would not automatically have come across. I certainly have attended the receptions over the year, and it's amazing the things you kind of pick up.
And I think it's important to stress it's not because politicians are uninterested, because honestly, as you'll know more than anyone, it's an issue of time. And to be able to have a channel and a platform where you can keep communication lines between businesses, schools and policymakers is so exceptionally important.
I think so, and it's important that it's beholden to nobody. People, pay to be part of the publication, pay to be members, and it's a way of not beholden to government, not beholden to anything.
Now, echoing the words, of course, your fellow chairman, Lord Blunkett, has said, what some might not know is that you started your political journey perhaps even further left than David Plunket.
Absolutely, I was a communist.
Now, what was
At
it?
the age of 14, I was bought the Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, and I read it from cover to cover. I tried to read it a few years back, and I just couldn't follow anything.
So I was going to say perhaps you might know the minds of the show front bench better than they do themselves.
From my position when I first joined, I would regard them as recalcitrant running dogs of the capitalist system.
Now, what was it that moved you from radical Marxists to running the only inner city council controlled by the Conservatives in the 80s?
Well, I was very young, and I was fascinated by what was happening in what was then Czechoslovakia and Dubček, and the revolution that was taking place there inside communism, and the way in which he was repressed by Mr. Brezhnev, and the tanks and taking over. I was so angry. And I'm 16, remember. I'm really angry. And I thought, what's the most outrageous thing I can do? I'll join the Conservative Party as a protest. And I kind of sticked around, and my family thought it was the funniest thing that ever happened to us. I was Eric the Tory. And
I think you announced this quite grandly as a grand protest.
I did indeed, but I kept going down, and it was an exciting time. People were developing the ideas of what the Conservative Party should be. Selsdon man, even Heath looked radical. We had different ideas, and it eventually clicked. And at some point, I became a Conservative, and that was 51 years ago. I think I'm definitely 100% a Tory now.
Through and through.
Through and through.
Although I do know the story, most people might guess that a dynamo Conservative like yourself would have perhaps a portrait of Mr. Thatcher or Mr. Churchill in their office, but who is it that you have?
I'd Che Guevara. Which I always had him over my left shoulder for visitors, and they always used to you see their eyes going up and thinking, who, can't possibly be it. Someone asked me if it was Desi Arnaz. I thought it was married to Lucille Ball. But no, the reason I did that was to remind me and to remind my officials that without constant vigilance, the cigar-chomping commies would take over.
I'm sure David Blunt was in the room to reply to that, actually. But in that long journey, you eventually ended up, of course, in 2010, doing something most Conservatives would never thought they would have to do, but in a coalition government with, of all people, the Liberal Democrats.
That's right.
Now, something I think perhaps today more than ever, people and our politics seems to be almost wholly determined on how we voted in a referendum 3 years ago.
Yeah, the most normal thing would happen after something like that would be the country would come together, and if anything, we're more divided. I mean, I thought working in the coalition, I'm proud to have been part of that coalition. I'm proud to have worked alongside the Liberal Democrats, who I think realise that, like all minority partners in a coalition, they would suffer at the polls.
Do you think we've lost the ability recently as a people to work with those that we might disagree with on issues more than we used to?
I'm not sure that's right. I mean, you can see various members of the Conservative Party working closely with Liberal Democrats and Labour to defeat their own government, but it's not a thing I think I would want to encourage.
Quite. And I should remind listeners, we are recording this in Victoria, just over the road at Cardinal Place, a fantastically new development site which wouldn't have been there without some of your legislation. What was the proudest?
I personally approved it.
Absolutely. What was the proudest moment, do you think, in serving Secretary for 5 years?
It's my actual proudest moment. We did a thing called Troubled Families, which was the first centre-right attempt to deal with poverty and to deal with difficult families that were causing a disproportionately large amount of call upon the upon the state, and it was on the basis of tough love. It's on the basis of getting people into jobs. It's about dealing with the kind of the family as a whole, not just one or two individuals that were having a problem. And I'm pleased that it's continued.
And since, I should very much stress, since of course you're stepped down to being an MP, you do have your weekends back, but that's not to say you haven't remained very active and very busy. Of course, continues the government's anti-corruption champion, shone the harsh light of day over malpractice in the local government. Indeed, the Queen's speech we've just had includes some of your recommendations from 2016. I think a couple of things on that. First of all, are you surprised, I may imagine you may not be, at some of the backlash towards, in this country, introducing voter ID for voting?
It is absurd, and it's particularly absurd coming from the Labour Party, because it was largely Labour's vulnerability that got my interest in trying to do something about it. And it's a bit like saying, you're requiring people to show some ID, that this is suppressing voting. It's a bit like saying the post office is suppressing parcels because they demand to see some ID. I think they've got a bee into their bonnet that this is something like that goes in the state to repress. It's not. It's about giving confidence to the system. Now, the Electoral Commission and foreign observers have warned us for such a long time that our electoral system is vulnerable. And it's to misquote John Major, we are really sort of old males cycling to Evensong and Warburn. Yeah, I mean, it's such a basic thing. It's an important thing. And it was kind of interesting in some of the trials. They did a focus group with a bunch of young Asian girls. And they said they thought the process of a photo ID would actually give them a greater confidence in the fairness of the system. I make all kinds of recommendations to stop postal vote harvesting, to stop various fraud taking place, to stop intimidation at counts, to stop intimidation outside polling stations.
I think you referenced it earlier, the Westminster bubble. A lot of the places where this occurs and the places where this does go on are places where perhaps many members, many people in the press don't usually go to.
No, they don't. We saw a YouGov poll that said the overwhelming majority, well in the 60%, thought this idea was sensible.
Yeah, and I imagine you're quite proud that recommendation is in the speech.
Yes, I mean, I'm a bit frustrated they didn't do it sooner, but nevertheless, I'm very happy that they are doing it.
It's as if the government's time has been taken up by something else and we've not focused on anything domestic.
Absolutely.
But with a man, though, with his roots in local government, do you think, and how much you've worked with that report, especially looking at them carefully, how would you rate our current state of local municipal politics?
Local government's very good. I mean, local government, don't get me wrong, it's by and large corruption free, and it does a remarkably good job. And it was, in truth, my worries about local government and that these measures were brought in. I don't believe the fraud is big enough to be able to take a parliamentary seat, but it is big enough to take a council. And if you are negligent, uncaring about the probity of the poll, you're likely to be equally negligent about the awarding of contracts to your friends. So it's all past that. But local government is a very enduring part of our constitution. I got a bit stick because we had to take some money from them, but by and large they survive very well.
Excellent. Now, beyond obviously that work, you're also, of course, the British envoy for post-Holocaust issues.
Yeah, sure.
Very dear to your heart. I know you've done some fantastic work recently, including with obviously former Shadow Chancellor from the Review, Ed Balls. Would you mind, if you could just let the listeners know what projects you are working on with that, and really the importance that has to so many communities around the country?
Well, I used to be very unpleasant about Ed Ball, and he used to be very unpleasant about me. But I found working with him remarkably easy, and we've not had a single row in 2 years, and by now we're beginning to be able to finish each other's sentences. We're building a memorial to the Holocaust next to Parliament with a learning centre below it, and the reason why the Prime Minister chose that site is that it was David Cameron, and he wanted to ensure that when people left the memorial, they would look and see Parliament and recognise that it was the last bastion against tyranny. But more important, to remind people who work in Parliament that the legislature has a choice. It can either protect its citizens or it can oppress its citizens. And we do know that it was a compliant legislature that brought in the Nuremberg laws. And at a time when there are parts of Europe that are seeking to rewrite their history and seeking to see themselves as only the victims of the Nazis, I'm determined that we should tell the truth in an unblinking way. We are, I suppose, at a critical crossroads when the last survivor is likely to be no longer with us within the next decade and a half. And at that point, we do know that history starts to be reassessed. I think it was Simon Sharma that talked about this, and he was referring to the French Revolution. And of course, most of the books written in the 1850s are the ones that have shaped our view of the French Revolution. But the difference is this, that slightly over 100 years ago, my grandfather Edgar grabbed hold of his Lee Enfield and walked out of a trench in the Somme and walked towards the Germans. And within a few minutes, most of the people he'd been brought up with, most of his friends were dead. Nobody doubts that he did that. But there's a whole industry out there that doubts that the Holocaust took place. So that's why it's important that we help frame that narrative.
And you referenced as well, it's so important, especially at this time of history, so many years afterwards, that young people in schools get the correct education about it. How do we compare as a country in doing that compared to some of our European friends?
We I think, compare remarkably well, and particularly because we've got a mixture of things. We ensure through the lessons of Auschwitz that 2 pupils from every secondary school go to Auschwitz each year, that they have a preliminary meeting, a visit and a wrap-up. We ensure that Holocaust Day is remembered in January. Now, I can remember starting that, or I'm not starting it, but being part of a foot soldier of people that put it together. And, it was like one man and a dog, but now it's quite a massive, it's a massive event. So I think we are quite good at remembering that. I think where we perhaps do need to have a wider understanding is beyond the death camps. And we need to kind of understand the Einsatzgruppen, which was the roving murder squads, how important they were. You were more likely to have been shot in a ditch than to end up in a death camp. And the hinterland of that is Lithuania, where I was last week talking to colleagues, and through Belarus and the Ukraine. And it's really important that we ensure that we register where those death sites are.
And I think certainly, and I'm going to sit down next to speak, which hopefully won't be too long away. It's something I think we'd be very happy to keep updates on how that project is going, because it's so important and people do need to be aware of it. Looking to the future, though, I imagine it could be actually very content and happy. Former Prime Minister, friend and colleague David Cameron just released his book, and you came quite unscathed from it.
I came out, it was very nice about
yes.
it. I even bought the audio version. because he was reading it, and he obviously, but there was a fair bit of affection, and I'm rather glad they left out one or two of the other embarrassing things.
Maybe not this time.
Yeah.
But it's important, I think, and I'm conscious of the time. I think it's important that today people have become so perhaps caught up in what's happening in this country regarding Brexit. Looking to the future, how would you, and what would you say that it's a positive thing that this country has to look forward to?
Well, we're a large trading nation. We're a large economy. We're a liberal democracy, and it would be good to get through Brexit over the coming years, and it would be good to start to look at some of the social issues that we need to tackle. Those have been left behind by our economic progress, and it will be good to see some solid investment in this country, both in terms of its infrastructure, but also in terms of the way it operates as a democracy.
And I know that's going to be a huge focus of the next review. Pickles, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
As always, it's been a pleasure interviewing and learning from our guests. I hope you've all enjoyed listening. Until next time, I'm off to the Albert to raise a glass to raising standards. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. You can find every episode on iTunes, YouTube, and Spotify. The views expressed by each guest in the podcast are their own. They do not represent the opinions of the Parliamentary Review, Westminster Publications, Lord Pickles, Lord Blunkett, David Curry, or any other guest on the podcast. If you'd like to know more about the Parliamentary Review, please visit www.theparliamentaryreview.co.uk.